Imagine being told that unless you own land, not a house, not a job, but land itself, you had no real political voice. This is the making of Britain, the story of how land, law and power shaped an island. In each episode, we trace a turning point that changed what Britain was and what it would become, the Britain that we know today. For centuries in Britain, power was tied to the soil beneath your feet. And it wasn't until the late 19th century that this ancient link between land ownership and political influence began to be severed. This is a story of the Representation of the People Act of 1884, a law that on the surface simply gave more men the right to vote. But in truth, it was a death knell of an old world where landowners alone dictated Britain's future. For most of British history, land wasn't just property, it was authority. From the Norman barons to Tudor gentry, owning acres meant wielding influence. Land determined wealth, social standing, and crucially, representation in Parliament. By the 18th century, this system was so entrenched that many thought it was natural. The House of Commons, despite its name, was dominated by the landowning class. Votes were restricted to freeholders, those with a stake in the soil. The theory was simple. Only landowners had enough interest in the stability of the kingdom to be trusted with political power. Our recurring figure, the parish clerk, would have seen this firsthand. He recorded who paid the poor rates, who held property, and who fell into dependence. He lived in a society where the tenant farmer, the labourer, and the tradesman could work hard their whole lives, yet never be seen as trustworthy participants in governance, because they did not own the ground they worked upon. But by the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had changed everything. Power was no longer just about land, it was about factories, railways, and bustling towns where thousands lived without owning a single acre. Yet, the political system still privileged the soil. How long could a system survive where the majority of working men who built the wealth of Britain's new industrial age were shut out of political life? The Great Reform Act of 1832, which we explored in another episode, had chipped away at the old order. Rotten boroughs were abolished and some new urban constituencies created. But while it widened the franchise, it still left the majority of working men excluded. The vote was extended, but only to those with property worth at least £10 a year. It was a reform of appearance rather than substance. It kept the balance of power firmly with landowning elite. By 1867, the Second Reform Act went further, granting the vote to many urban working men. The change was driven by mass demonstrations such as those of the Reform League, which showed how untenable the system had become. Still, rural workers, agricultural labourers and tenant farmers were left out. The landowner's dominance was preserved where it mattered most, in the countryside. The parish clerk's ledgers reflected the divide. In towns, he saw artisans and clerks casting their votes. In villages, his neighbours, men he had known all his life, still had no voice. The injustice was visible, but Parliament stalled. So what finally pushed Britain to extend the vote to rural men? By the 1870s, the labourer's voice could no longer be ignored. The Agricultural Labourers' Union, founded in 1872, gave rural workers an organised platform. Newspapers carried their grievances, and the growing literacy of the countryside meant that their arguments spread widely. Industrialisation had made Britain wealthier, but in many villages, the landless poor still lived in near medieval conditions. The idea that they were too ignorant or irresponsible to vote seemed increasingly absurd. Prime Minister William Gladstone, leader of the Liberal Party, recognised the danger of delay. If the system continued to exclude so many men, it risked revolution rather than reform. His conservative rival, Benjamin Disraeli, had already gained credit for the 1867 Act. Gladstone wanted to claim the mantle of reform for himself. Thus, in 1884, Gladstone introduced the Third Reform Act, formerly the Representation of the People Act. But was this really a democratic breakthrough, or another compromise dressed as progress? The Act was deceptively simple. It extended the household franchise established in towns by 1867 to the countryside. That meant that any man who rented a house worth £10 a year or who occupied land of a certain value now had the vote. In practical terms, this nearly doubled the electorate, adding over 2 million men, largely agricultural workers, to the rolls. For the first time, rural labourers stood alongside their urban counterparts in political representation. Our parish clerk would have been amongst those tallying the new voters. He would have seen neighbours once ignored now recognised as citizens with a voice. Election days in villages changed forever. But crucially, the Act still left out huge swathes of society. Women were excluded entirely. Lodgers and many of the poorest men who did not meet the property requirements remained disenfranchised. The Act maintained the principle that property, however small, was the gateway to political rights. It was progress, but progress bound by caution. The 1884 Act was followed by the Redistribution of Seats Act in 1895, which redrew the electoral map. Many rural constituencies, long controlled by landlords, were cut down in size, while industrial towns gained more representation. Landowners resisted bitterly. The House of Lords, dominated by peers with vast estates, initially rejected the bill. Only after negotiations and the threat of constitutional crisis did they relent. For centuries, Britain's elite had argued that political stability required landowners to lead. Yet here was a state admitting, however reluctantly, that agricultural workers deserved recognition. Our parish clerk recorded the change in his books, but he also knew how far there was to go. Women in his parish still had no vote. Young men without property remained excluded. It was no revolution. It was rather the slow unravelling of an old truth, that land equalled power. But how long could Britain continue to withhold democracy from women and the poorest men? The 1884 Act marks the beginning of the end for the political dominance of landowners. Their wealth and influence persisted, but increasingly Britain's future lay in the hands of a broader electorate. In hindsight, the Act looks like a stepping stone from aristocracy towards democracy. It was not universal suffrage, but it cleared the way for the 20th century reforms that would bring women into the franchise and abolish property qualifications entirely. The land itself no longer dictated the limits of political voice. Britain was entering a new age. The Representation of the People Act of 1884 was a compromise, yes, but it was also a turning point. It broke the monopoly of land and recognised that power in Britain could not remain forever tied to acres of soil. Our parish clerk, who had watched centuries of law tie political rights to property, could now look around and see a community where the labourer, the tenant and the craftsman had a say in shaping the nation. And yet the story of democracy was far from complete. Women would wait another generation for recognition. The poorest men still struggled to find their place. The question of who deserves a voice remained unsettled. Thank you for walking a little further down the road that made Britain with me. The story winds on. Try this one. I think you'll like it. Until then, thanks so much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you very soon.